All right, short reviews for September 6th. Now, this month I had a bunch of other lists I was going to do, and I'm still going to every week, but this was going to be, like 25 or 30 short reviews that I had to cut down to 15 because that would just take too long. I Unfortunately, I no longer have enough time to crank out a 30 album list in a couple of days. But we still get, I would think, a very well honed down chunk of the releases from the first 3 weeks of September that are selected for quality. And we start with the Castron's Chaos as a New World. This came out on the first of the month, and I think that it's not a band that really jumps out at you. The album art is pretty strong and evocative, but their style is black death metal in a sort of bestial style that has been infused with traditional heavy metal influences, and that could sound Bathory-esque, or it could sound like traditional heavy metal. It could sound like metal punk at 1 minute, and war metal the next. So this is probably their most refined release. It seems like they're landing upon a strong point of view with this one, and the only problem is that it distracted me quite a bit with this Stormtrooper cover on here, Armies of the Night. That is a very deep cut from early power metal, and it's a great one. It's a really great band and a catchy song. So if that doesn't catch you too far off guard, I think the rest of the record will make sense, but it's not quite as musical and interesting as that cover. So, not a detriment at all. It's a great reference, and it's a solid record. So you'll notice I've not been writing or talking about a ton of deeper underground black metal this year, and it's because I feel like the quality has just dipped in terms of there's a lot of conformity. There's a lot of really underskilled and uninteresting groups making a lot of kind of bland stuff. And I hate to start with a rant here, but I think this is a good example of someone evolving quickly, intelligently, and creating a very strong sound that has a little bit of the 90s revivalism that's been going on intermittently over the last 5 years, focusing on like dungeon synth and a lot of the kitsch elements of early 90s black metal, but creating a mid-paced sort of mystic feeling is the strength of what Luring are doing with the Triumphant Fall of the Malignant Christ. Now, this came out, I think, a couple of months ago, and it's now finally finding its way to vinyl. And I think it's a worthy album in that respect because it is a substantial record. There are riffs on this thing. I think that's where they need to work the most to develop any interest from me is the guitar riffs, but there is kind of a doomed, and not really doomed, but atmospheric feeling to this record that is quite successful in its menace and its sort of more stomping pieces. There's some real hits here in terms of the drumming kind of. We're doing a lot of the work to get there with the march of the record overall. I like the themes. I like the artwork. It's a strong package overall. I just think if this guy could cut like a bigger riff more often, it would be a much higher rating. Petrol is the second full-length album from Tar Pond, and this was a band that Martin E. Ein had started, I think, 2014 I think he'd passed in 2014, so it was a couple years before that. Anyway, this is a doom metal band, a sort of post-metal infused doom metal style, which has some alternative rock touches to the way that it sounds. And I only say that because there's some good vocal harmonies on here that have sort of a Lane Staley-esque feeling to them in the way that they're presented. Otherwise, this is a plodding, aggressive, and kind of hulking modern doom metal record, which is I think it took a couple of listens to really get into it and to sort of start craving that sound. It is very heavy. It's eerie, and I think very well produced in the sense that it reeled me in back for many listens. So you'll see the audiovisual side of it is highly rated, and I think it's definitely worth checking out, and that's one of the higher recommendations on this list. So eager Stranger in a Wasteland is the third full-length album from Italian black metal project Himes. And this is from Algol Forgotten Tomb, who is uh, probably more interested in a more polished sort of not quite black and roll, but Celtic Frost-esque movement on this record, and it feels both traditional and a little bit accessible. Where uh, there are a couple of very strange moments on here that are sort of related to heavy rock and sort of anthemic songs where the lyrics I didn't really understand what I was listening to. And then there are other parts that are heavily influenced by sort of the rocking side of Scandinavian black metal. So uh, it's a good record. I think the very fine production values, very strong performances, and presentation overall. I didn't really connect with this record on a very deep level. I didn't really I wasn't feeling it, I guess.
No matter what you think, we'll think the same word. Even if you feel superior and rare, the great leveler does not care.
Mazaroth from Sodom Misery is another record that I just didn't really connect with very much. I think it's a very strong value generated here in terms of uh, a different type of melodic death metal, which is very modern with symphonic elements and uh, a little quite a bit different from their debut in some aspects. With there's maybe that's just different people involved and different production values overall. But for me, this reads as just kind of modern metal. It does try to be accessible in a very direct way, and it generally gets there. There's several memorable songs on here. I didn't find myself drawn back to it in such a way, but I think if you're a fan of the more approachable side of hypocrisy, the that point in Atrocity's career where they started using more symphonic elements, and of course, bands like Dark Funeral, you'll understand what the appeal is of this record. It just didn't match up with my taste in any way, and I was kind of disappointed because I liked the first record quite a bit more.
I see it's coming, psychogenic, nowhere to escape, passing into pain, alone.
Revengeance is the third full-length album from Biocancer, and this is a Athens, Greece-based band who were initially known for their melodic death metal influenced thrash metal. And back then, people weren't willing to admit that a lot of the thrash metal that came out in the early 2000s was much more influenced by bands like The Haunted than it was, or like just At the Gates in terms of riffing, than it was, actual thrash metal. And I think they had a lot to do with that. They were basically putting out melodic death metal albums uh, early on in the 2000s. That's just my take. Obviously, bands like Skeleton Witch had a lot more success with it in other ways. So this is something related to that. This is they've taken a full step away from their thrash metal roots, but they've kept what was interesting about Biocancer, which was they're very dense and aggressive and strangely rhythmic, and very taut compositions, which definitely make for interesting melodic death metal. It's melodic death thrash metal. It's a little bit of groove here and there too, but it's not exactly Enemy of God either. So this is a pretty interesting record. It is catchy enough to recommend. It is there are riffs on this thing, and I think that if you're a fan of melodic death thrash metal of the early 2000s, that this will be an exciting record for you. I think the vocals will take a little bit to get used to. That's always kind of So Mexico City-based thrash metal band Strike Master have been around for quite a long time. They put out quite a few records, and I think to me they're always kind of at their best with a sort of creator-esque sound. And unfortunately, this record is mostly a miss for my taste. I think that it is too groove oriented. There are very simple, bland riffs all over this thing. Um, and the early 90s groove metal simplicity of it doesn't amount to a tuneful nature. And there's a lot of it is just kind of sluggish. There's no real catchiness to the song. The grooves aren't really serving the song. They're just filling time and space. So in a lot of ways, this will aesthetically feel like an exciting thrash metal record to start. You know, the vocalist guitarist is very charismatic, and unfortunately, the record itself just kind of falls apart in the details. There's really not. It's not as exciting as it seems when you really get into it. It's very straightforward, and not in a just in a very plain, generic way. So, not a terrible album. It's just I didn't see what stood out about it at all. So I was hoping to be a little bit more into 410. This is the latest album from Superlinks, which is an Oslo, Norway-based psychedelic rock and kind of stoner doom adjacent band, who really impressed me with Electric Temple, their last album. Uh, there's this jammed feeling, there's this emergent feeling that's coming from their music lately that I've really enjoyed, and I've liked the singles that they put out lately. But when I sat down with this record, I just didn't feel like it had anywhere to go. It felt like a lot of the songs were very similar. Their launch was very slow and steady, and I wasn't really in the right mood for it, I don't think. And when I came back to it, it just didn't really ever take off at any point. This is a very chill record, so I I didn't mind that about it. It's just that it didn't stick out enough to really stick in mind. So good record, not a great record. So, as someone who grew up during various revivals of, rockabilly, psychobilly, those types of ska, all that stuff, and how that all glommed together into swing music revivals and all that shit. Coming back to a band like the Coffin Shakers is kind of fun because it is kind of their work is kind of locked into that kitsch, that throwback rock feeling, but their lyrics are they're deeply darker than, like, gothic rock would have been around the time, or something like that. They're very severe, they're very clever, and the vocalist is very easily remembered, I think, for his sound. We recently heard him in Die Oberherren, which was a different type of gothic rock, and this is more horror country, I guess. It is. I wouldn't use the word country so quickly, but there is sort of a feeling of steady, yeah, steady country rock feeling to some of these songs. Otherwise, they're very vocally driven. They're certainly driven by their lyrics, and the production values here are, obviously 10 times better than they were back in the 2000s when they released their first two records, which were maybe a bit more raw, maybe more related to the garage rock revival stuff back then in terms of their sound design. And then this is much more just professionally recorded. And a couple of really unforgettable songs in here. It maybe, even if you just think it's funny, you go listen to it because it's just catchy. And I had a great time with this record.
As the dead will walk the earth and blood will flood the streets, you'll pass into the kingdom of the night. And death shall be our guardian, and death shall be our guide.
Helvetin Kone is the latest album from Silundbyhalanen, and this is obviously this is a Finnish band based on that name, and it is a great one. This is a very melodic band from Rutokieli, from Barathrum and White Rune, and it is decidedly melodic black metal, which is anthemic, and I think this is a more sentimental or dark metal inspired album based on some of these melodies he's used this time around. I think it is still very close in relation to his previous record. They complement each other in very direct ways, and I think this is he just continues to be a great songwriter and performer, and yeah, I think this stuff is. I just didn't really have much to write about in a long form review that I hadn't said already. This is just a notable band in the Finnish underground that you should know if you like catchy melodic black metal songs. I could go on a rant about weird grind and grindcore that was meant to catch your attention back in the day, and we could talk all up and down the road about bands like Discordant Axis, who were both very smart and psychotic in what they did. It was sort of a coming together of a lot of impressive individuals as they sort of started their career in some ways. So what stood out about that band still stands out about this alternative reality in Gridlink, which features some of those members, but also Takafumi Matsubara, who is the guitarist here, and his performances have kind of been pushed back into the background, while the vocals and the drums are really the focus of this record in terms of its production and creating a different atmosphere than Longhena. Now, it's been a long time. The guitarist injured himself, and they were just kind of called it quits. And this is their way of coming back here many years later. And their last record has kind of universally seen as an important one and a very celebrated one. So there's a lot on the shoulders of this release, whether it's good or not. So, yes, it is if you like this style. I think the production style is very different. This is less polished. I think that last record was kind of on like a later Nasum level of fidelity, and this is a little bit more dry, a little bit more focused on the percussion, and the guitars again are a little bit buried for my taste, and that was kind of my own problem with it. And we don't really hear the bass guitar, which is whatever. Uh, Otherwise, it is a psychotic, full speed, weird grind that you would want. And I got a kick out of it. I couldn't say that I wanted to return to it. It was, you know, this has never been fully my taste. I kind of prefer something a little like I really enjoy Cognizant and Watchmaker and some of these things that are somewhat similar. So. Uh, yeah, if you're already a fan of this band, you're going to love this thing. And I think I've always been about this much of a fan of this style. So there's something to be said for labeling something in a creative way and sort of getting people to think about it that way. It's putting spin on things with subgenres is pretty interesting as a way of creating extra conversations about something that is quite simple. And that would be the case with Hungarian quartet Grimheart, who describe themselves as a melodic power death metal band, which is as neither here nor there, really. There's elements of folk and symphonic power metal that are more prominent in their work, and it is very much a power metal band in the vein of something like Ensiferum, where there's melodic metal at the charge of it. There is a little bit of extreme metal at the behest of the vocalist, but they end up sounding more like, Ensiferum or Thurfing or bands that are driven by folkish and melodic tendencies that amount to melodic death metal of a certain era. And that makes this probably a lot less interesting to a lot of people who are interested in what a melodic power death metal band might sound like. And they sound about how you'd expect. They're a lot of melodic death metal tropes from the late 90s and early 2000s that are in their sound. It's not exactly troll metal or anything, but it comes close in its feeling. And I found that there was way too much singing on this record. There was not enough shredding or interest that kind of makes these bands all that fun. And it just seemed a little bit average for my taste, even though it was interesting figuring out what this was. Beyond Frozen Heights is the latest EP from Heronian, and this is a Italian melodic black death metal band with members who are best known from Valgrind and Hateful and Blood of Seclusion. Their aim is something dissection-esque, certainly at the gates otherwise, and you sort of feel that in the way they developed jagged and rushed polyrhythmic compositions, which are what I would consider tense, almost as if programmed, as if you're keeping the beat to a program for recording a guitar. And in some sense, they play with that tightness and that irregularity with dismember-esque grooves, so it makes for melodic death metal that feels old but new. And I think where they do their best work is in those polyrhythmic, uh, sort of jagged movements that are uh, probably the best parts of their debut LP from 2021, and they sort of emphasize that here. That is kind of what is most interesting about this band. Um, I would. It doesn't fully come together for me, but this was one of the better records I sat down and listened to this month in terms of something unexpected for melodic death metal, and that I could see them going somewhere with this further over time. So overall, I have always enjoyed the work of Kvelertak. I love their debut album. I think that the self-title is fantastic. I could listen to it today and still get the same energy out of it that I did back in, like, what, 2010 or so. Um, and each record from that point, the second one was okay, but each one after that point has been diminishing returns as they adventure more into just steadier rock influences, leaning away from the punkish side of the band, becoming more anthemic and elaborate, and still kind of working a little bit more thrash on this record. I think it's their fifth record, and I've kind of lost interest in their gimmick and don't find a lot of depth in their songwriting. And I think that that's not at fault. They've been additive over the years, and I think the great thing about this band is they were doing so much, but they lost that excitable simplicity that made them great in the first place. And the interrupting rock guitar part has now become the full rock suite, and the 8-minute song, and that takes me out of what I ever wanted out of the band early on. So maybe I overplayed their first record, but that's an all-time great for me in that style. Some people find that surprising, but I really love the first record from this band, and that's why I picked this one up. I think that it tries to do too much. It's a bit overlong, and I think and while it does put together some, like, higher energy sort of throwback rock moments and whatnot, um, they've sort of strayed too far from what I like about their stuff, basically. But I still think it's a totally listenable record. There's side A is enough for me, but feel free to cut through the whole thing. Howrun is a psychedelic doom rock band from Oakland, California. This is a very surrealistic, slow-paced, and I guess atmospheric band that really has focused on pulling back, slowing down, and being very subtle with their movements, while using a lot of reverb and slow movement to make some very heady songs from their work. And they're pretty repetitive with what they do on the first half of the album. They kind of break up the pacing later on, but overall, Wilting Within is a memorable, kind of different record that has a really strong vocalist, and I really like the shimmering feeling of all of it and the very slow pace of it all. So, well, we're checking out if you like that kind of thing.